Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. I had been looking for a way to break out of my routine and meet new people, so joining a hiking group seemed like the perfect idea. I loved nature, and the thought of spending weekends exploring trails with people who shared the same passion sounded ideal. The group had been recommended through a local community board, and the reviews were mostly positive. They scheduled regular hikes on weekends, often choosing scenic routes just outside the city. I signed up for one of their events without hesitation. The morning of the hike, I packed a small bag with essentials: water, some snacks, a light jacket, and a fully charged phone. I arrived at the trailhead early, hoping to introduce myself and get to know the others before we set off. Everyone seemed friendly, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all chatting in small groups. One person stood out right away, though. They were more confident, more vocal, and seemed to take an unofficial leadership role. They introduced themselves with a firm handshake and asked if I had done many hikes before. I said I had done a few solo ones, but nothing too serious. They smiled and told me I would enjoy this trail. As we set off, the group spread out naturally, some people chatting, others quietly enjoying the walk. The weather was perfect. Cool morning air, soft sunlight filtering through the trees, and the earthy scent of leaves and pine underfoot. After about an hour, we reached a clearing where everyone stopped to rest and have water. I sat on a fallen log, sipping from my bottle and enjoying the view. That same person walked over and sat beside me, striking up a conversation. They asked about where I was from, how long I had lived in the area, what I did for work. It felt casual, friendly, even flattering. I was a little surprised at the attention, but I didn't think too much of it. After the break, we continued, but this time they walked closer to me, making small talk and occasionally pointing out interesting things along the trail. At one point, they mentioned a lesser-known spot nearby with a great view. I asked if the group would be heading that way, but they said it was off-trail, something only locals knew about. They added that it wasn't far, and we could catch up with the group quickly afterward. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to leave the main trail. I didn't know this person well, and I wasn't familiar with the area. But their tone was confident, and they seemed so sure it would be worth it. I looked ahead and saw the rest of the group still walking at a steady pace. I didn't want to be rude or overly cautious. Against my better judgment, I nodded and followed them. The trail faded quickly behind us as we moved into denser forest. The sounds of the group faded too, replaced by the crunch of our steps on the forest floor and the occasional bird call. I asked how much further, and they said just a little more. I noticed they kept glancing over their shoulder and adjusting their pace. Something in their behavior shifted, becoming more focused, less conversational. We stopped at a spot with a small ridge, a steep slope below filled with trees and rocks. It didn't offer much of a view, and I started to question why we were there. I turned to say something, but their expression had changed. They stepped closer, their posture a little too direct, their voice quieter but more intense. They asked if I wanted to rest there for a bit. I felt my stomach tighten. I shook my head and said I thought we should head back to the group. I tried to keep my tone light, casual, not wanting to provoke anything. They stepped even closer, blocking the narrow path behind me. I felt trapped, unsure of what to say or do next. I looked around, trying to stay calm. The forest suddenly felt darker, quieter, more distant from everything safe and familiar. I repeated that we should head back, my voice firmer this time. Their smile faded, and for a moment we both stood there in silence. Then, without a word, they turned and started walking, expecting me to follow. I hesitated before moving. I stayed a few steps behind, my senses heightened. I kept my eyes on the trail, silently noting landmarks as we walked, hoping I would recognize something that would lead me back to the main path. We walked in silence for a while, the tension still heavy in the air. I watched closely, making sure not to lose my sense of direction. But when I saw a break in the trees, I recognized part of the original trail. Relief flooded through me. I could hear faint voices ahead, laughter, the soft murmur of the group. I quickened my pace slightly and moved past them, stepping back onto the main trail without a word. The others didn't seem to have noticed my absence. They were busy taking pictures and resting. I stayed close to the center of the group from then on. I didn't mention what happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. I just wanted to finish the hike and get back to my car. For the rest of the hike, that person stayed near the back. They didn't speak to me again. I kept glancing over my shoulder just in case. When we finally returned to the parking lot, I got in my car and locked the doors right away. I sat for a moment, taking deep breaths, trying to process everything. I felt foolish for having followed them, but I was also proud of myself for staying alert and getting back safely. Later that evening, I reported what happened to the group's moderator through the online platform. I described the situation carefully, without making assumptions but being clear about what I experienced. They responded quickly, said they would look into it, and thanked me for bringing it to their attention. I never heard what came of it, but I noticed that person's name disappeared from the member list a few days later. I didn't go on another group hike for a while. I stuck to familiar trails, places I had explored before, and always told someone where I was going. Eventually, I joined a different group, one that was smaller and more organized. I met a few kind people there and slowly started to feel safe hiking again. I still remembered that day clearly, but I didn't let it stop me from doing what I loved. Hiking became something different after that. It wasn't just about the fresh air and exercise anymore. It became a reminder to trust my instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong, and to always stay aware of my surroundings. Nature had not changed, but the way I moved through it had. I learned to listen to the quiet not just with wonder, but with awareness. The experience taught me that not everyone in a group shares the same intentions. It made me cautious, but it didn't make me afraid. I continued to explore trails, meet new people, and appreciate the beauty around me. I just did it on my terms, with a clearer understanding of how quickly a situation can shift. Most importantly, I never forgot how important it is to stay connected to others, even in remote places. I often return to that trail, but I stick to the marked paths. Sometimes when the sun is just rising and the forest is waking up, I think about how different that day could have ended. I'm grateful it didn't. I'm grateful I listened to that small voice inside that told me something was wrong. And every time I lace up my boots, I carry that lesson with me. Story 2. I had worked security at the same office building for almost 2 years. It was a decent job, mostly quiet, with long stretches of time spent monitoring surveillance feeds or walking through empty hallways. The building was 10 stories tall with 3 levels of underground parking, and most of the companies that operated there worked normal business hours. That meant my night shifts were usually uneventful, just routine checks and the occasional delivery or cleaning crew. I liked the quiet and the predictability. On most nights, I made my rounds starting from the top floor and worked my way down. I had a pattern I followed to make sure nothing got overlooked, and I always made a point to check the stairwells, service doors, and maintenance access points. There were a few areas that required more attention than others, like the mechanical room on the lower level and the utility tunnels that ran beneath the parking garage. Those tunnels were old, built into the original structure decades ago, and were mostly used for wiring, plumbing, and emergency access. I never liked going down there. The tunnels were narrow and dimly lit, and the sound carried in strange ways. Even a light footstep echoed off the walls like it came from all directions. Most of the other guards avoided the tunnels unless there was a specific reason to go, and I used to feel the same. But one night, something caught my attention on the camera feeds. A light flickered on in one of the tunnel corridors, a light that should have stayed off unless someone was down there. I double-checked the maintenance schedule, but there were no authorized visits planned. I grabbed my flashlight and keys, radioed in that I was checking the lower levels, and made my way to the service elevator. By the time I got to the entrance of the tunnel, the light had gone off. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the faint hum of machinery and the distant hum of ventilation. I entered the tunnel slowly, sweeping my flashlight from side to side. It smelled like old cement and dust, with just a hint of mildew. The walls were lined with metal piping, most of it wrapped in insulation that had started to peel over time. I kept walking, deeper into the maze of tunnels, following the path I had memorized during training. Then I saw it. A trail of footprints in the dust. They were fresh, leading away from one of the junction doors. I followed them cautiously. The tunnel curved sharply, and as I turned the corner, I noticed something odd. A section of the wall looked different, like the panel had been removed and then carefully put back in place. I stepped closer and reached out to touch it. The panel moved under my fingers, revealing a narrow opening just big enough for someone to squeeze through. I hesitated, then shone my flashlight inside. What I saw made my stomach turn. Behind the panel was a small hidden space, barely large enough to stand in, but someone had made it livable. There was a sleeping bag, a pile of clothes, half-empty water bottles, food wrappers, and even a small camping stove. There was also a stack of notebooks and an old radio. The space looked like it had been used for quite some time. I backed out carefully and radioed for assistance. I waited outside the tunnel for another guard to arrive. When he got there, we went back in together, both of us uneasy about what we might find. We didn't know if the person was still nearby, or if they had slipped away when they saw me coming. We searched the surrounding area, but the tunnels were long and full of hiding places. There was no sign of whoever had been living there. It was like they had vanished into the walls. The next morning, the building manager and a team from the maintenance department were brought in. They examined the makeshift shelter and confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been living there for months, completely unnoticed. They had tapped into the building's emergency power lines to run a small lamp and had found a way to siphon water from one of the old utility pipes. It was shocking how carefully everything had been hidden. The police were called, and an investigation was launched. They didn't find much at first, just the belongings and signs that the person had recently left. The notebooks were full of writing, but most of it was hard to understand. Some of it looked like lists, others like journal entries, and a few pages had detailed maps of the tunnels. It was clear the person knew the layout better than we did. Security footage was reviewed again and again, and after several days, they finally found a pattern. Every few nights, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning, a figure would appear in the shadows near the service entrance or elevator shafts. They wore dark clothes and kept their head down, always staying just outside of the camera's full view. It became clear that the person had been watching us, learning our patterns and avoiding detection. The footage also revealed something else. The person had used the building's exits during the day, blending in with delivery workers or visitors. They had likely entered the building through one of the rear loading docks months earlier and had simply never left. It was disturbing how easy it had been for them to remain invisible. The only reason they were discovered at all was because of that single flicker of light. Eventually, the police tracked down the person in a park not far from the building. They were arrested without incident. I was told later that the individual had once worked as a contractor in the building and had fallen on hard times. They had returned out of desperation, using their knowledge of the building's structure to create a shelter. They had never intended to hurt anyone. They just wanted a place to stay warm and safe. I felt a mix of emotions when I heard that. Part of me was relieved that no one had been harmed, and another part of me was uneasy knowing how easily the situation could have escalated. But mostly I felt a strange kind of sympathy. I had walked those halls for years and never once imagined someone might be hiding just out of sight. It made me think about how often we overlook people who are right there in front of us. The building management increased security after that. New locks were installed on all utility access points and more cameras were added to cover blind spots. I was given additional responsibilities, and my rounds were expanded to include deeper checks of maintenance areas. I no longer avoided the tunnels. I walked them carefully, checking every door and panel, making sure nothing had been disturbed. Months went by without incident, and life returned to normal at the building. But I never forgot what had happened. It changed the way I looked at my job, and it changed the way I thought about people. Every time I passed one of the old tunnel doors, I remembered the hidden space and the quiet presence that had once lived there. It reminded me that even in the most secure places, there are always things we miss. I continued working there for another year before moving on to a different position. The experience stayed with me, not as a warning, but as a lesson. I learned to pay attention to the details and to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Most of all, I learned that sometimes the people who go unseen are the ones we need to notice the most. It was not a night I would ever forget, but I was grateful it ended the way it did, with understanding rather than tragedy. Story 3. Thorny. It started out as nothing more than an uncomfortable feeling. I could not explain why, but I began to notice that this one particular coworker seemed to know more about me than he should have. He would comment on places I had been or things I had done the night before, things I had not talked about with anyone. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence or idle workplace gossip. But the frequency and accuracy of his comments made me feel like I was being watched. One morning he greeted me and mentioned the restaurant I had visited the night before, describing the interior in unsettling detail. I had gone there on a whim, and I had not told a single soul. My heart sank as he laughed it off like a lucky guess, but I knew there was no way he could have known. That was the moment when I started paying closer attention. Something was definitely wrong. I began keeping track of what I shared with people at work, limiting conversations and being more cautious online. But still, he knew things. He would casually bring up which gym I had tried or a new park I had visited. These were not places I frequented, and I never posted about them. I felt like I was losing control of my privacy. Every time he spoke, it felt like a test, like he was waiting to see how I would react. I started to wonder if someone else was telling him these things, so I confided in a trusted colleague. She was shocked by what I told her and promised she had never shared anything about me. We even went over the possibility that someone was hacking my phone or computer. I checked my devices, changed my passwords, and removed access to unnecessary apps. Despite these efforts, the strange observations continued, and he grew bolder. One day he mentioned a private road I had used to avoid traffic, a route that not even my closest friends knew about. I felt cold all over. That was when I realized this was more than a creepy coworker. I was being tracked. I started to take inventory of my surroundings, my routines, and even my belongings. I wanted to find out how he was doing it. Then something strange happened. I noticed the company printer had been used late one night when no one else was in the office. The logs showed that files had been printed using my name and credentials. I had not been there at that time. I asked it for help, and they confirmed that someone had logged into my account remotely from a different workstation. That was the first clue that led me to believe he had access to more than I thought. The office had security badges for entry and exit, and I asked if it was possible to check his movements. The security team hesitated at first, citing privacy concerns, but after I explained the situation, they agreed to investigate. When they checked the logs, they discovered that he had been staying late several nights each week. He had accessed files for my projects and had even requested keys to storage rooms that were off limits to most staff. Everything started to click into place. I asked myself what else he could have done with that access. I went over every piece of equipment in the office, every device he could have used. That was when I remembered the company had GPS trackers for field equipment. Most were used for delivery vans or remote devices, but there were spares stored in the tech room. I checked the sign-out logs, and sure enough, his name was listed as having borrowed one a few weeks back. I went to my car that evening and searched every inch of it. It took a while, but I finally found a small, square device tucked under the rear bumper, out of sight. My heart pounded as I pulled it free. I knew then that he had placed it there. He had used company equipment to track me outside of work. I took photos and kept the device. I had proof now. I brought everything to Human Resources the next morning. I presented the photos, the security logs, and the GPS tracker. They were shocked. They promised to handle it discreetly and said they would begin an internal investigation immediately. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. I had taken a big step, but I did not know what the outcome would be. Later that day, I received a call from someone in upper management. They assured me they were taking the situation seriously and thanked me for speaking up. They placed him on leave pending the results of the investigation. It felt like a victory, but I still had to be cautious. I changed my routines and avoided going anywhere alone for a while. The fear had not gone away. Over the following days, I started to feel safer. There were no more strange comments, no unexplained sightings or mentions of places I had been. I began to regain a sense of control over my life. Human Resources kept me updated throughout the process. They eventually found enough evidence to terminate his employment. He was banned from the premises and reported to the authorities. I never saw him again after that. I continued to work for the company for a few more months before deciding to find a new job. I needed a fresh start in a new environment. It was not easy to move past the experience, but I learned how important it is to trust your instincts and take action when something feels wrong. I learned that even in professional settings, there can be people who cross the line in dangerous ways. Now, I take extra steps to protect my privacy. I regularly check my devices and surroundings. I am careful about what I share both online and in person. I also speak up when I notice something off, whether it is at work or in public. What happened to me could have ended differently, but I am grateful I acted when I did. The company made changes as a result of my case. They improved access controls, added more training for staff on harassment and stalking, and implemented stricter security around equipment usage. It made me feel like my experience had helped prevent others from going through something similar. I found comfort in knowing that something good came out of something terrifying. In time, the fear faded. It took effort and support, but I eventually returned to feeling like myself again. I found a new job, one that values transparency and safety. I met new people and built new routines. The experience changed me, but it also made me stronger. I will never forget what happened, but I do not let it define me. I live with more awareness and more intention. I know now that speaking up matters, that trusting your gut is not weakness but strength. My story had a good ending, and for that I am thankful. Story 4. It was late when I pulled into the driveway. I had stayed out longer than planned, visiting a friend across town and losing track of the time. The sky was dark, and the only sound was the soft hum of crickets in the bushes. I felt tired but content as I walked up to the door, fishing my keys out of my pocket. The porch light flickered slightly when I turned it on, but I barely noticed it then. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by the usual quiet of my home. Everything seemed normal at first glance. I dropped my bag near the couch and walked to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. That was when I noticed something strange. The salt and pepper shakers were on the opposite side of the stove. I paused, staring at them. I always kept them on the right side, not the left. It was one of those little habits I never thought about. I reached out and moved them back without really thinking, chalking it up to a lapse in memory. But the moment stayed with me as I finished my water and wandered into the living room. There, another odd detail caught my eye. One of the picture frames on the shelf had been turned slightly to the left. I always kept it centered, perfectly aligned with the edge of the bookshelf. I stepped over and adjusted it back into place, trying to dismiss the growing unease in my chest. Maybe I had knocked it earlier and just forgot. I started to look around more carefully. The throw pillows on the couch were out of their usual order. One was upside down. The TV remote, usually resting on the table, was placed neatly on the armrest. Each detail was minor, just slightly off. But together, they painted a picture that made my skin crawl. I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, switching on lights as I went. The bathroom door was half open. I always left it fully closed or wide open, never in between. I peeked inside, but everything else seemed fine. Towels were in place, the toothbrush still sitting in the cup. In my bedroom, it was the closet that caught my attention. The door was cracked open. I kept it shut. I stood frozen for a moment, listening for any sounds, any creaks or movements. But my heart pounded as I stepped forward and slowly pulled the door open the rest of the way. Nothing. Clothes hung undisturbed, shoes neatly lined up. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains, in every drawer. No one was there, no signs of forced entry. No broken windows or open doors, just subtle signs that someone had been there and taken the time to move things around. I checked the front and back doors again. Both were locked. I examined every window, looking for cracks or gaps, but everything was sealed. I even went outside and looked for footprints in the yard, but the ground was dry, undisturbed. I stood there, hands in my pockets, trying to make sense of it all. Eventually, I called the non-emergency number for the local authorities. I told them I suspected someone had been in my house, but nothing was missing. They sent an officer to check things out. He walked through the house with me, listened to my story, and nodded thoughtfully. He said there was no sign of forced entry, and without anything stolen, it would be hard to file a report. He asked if I had roommates or family members who might have visited. I told him no, I lived alone. He asked if I could have moved things myself and forgotten. I shook my head. He was polite but clearly doubtful. He said I should consider changing my locks just in case, and to call again if anything else happened. After he left, I sat in the living room with the lights on. I didn't feel safe sleeping just yet. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to remember if I had touched anything before leaving earlier that day. But I knew my habits too well. The salt and pepper shakers, or the picture frame, the remote. These were things I never moved from their places. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept getting up to check the doors and windows. But every little creak of the house made me jump. I left the hallway light on and kept my phone close by. Eventually I dozed off just before the sun came up, but it was a restless kind of sleep. The next day, I took the officer's advice and called a locksmith. They came out that afternoon and changed every lock in the house. I also installed a basic security system with cameras and motion sensors, but it gave me a small sense of comfort, even though I still felt unsettled. I went through every inch of the house again, checking drawers and corners, making sure nothing else had been moved or touched. Over the next week, nothing else happened. The cameras didn't pick up anything unusual. The house stayed exactly as I left it each time I came home. I began to relax again, though I never quite let my guard down. I started locking my bedroom door at night and keeping a flashlight and phone on my nightstand. Then, one morning I found a single fork placed on the living room coffee table. Just one. I stood there, staring at it, trying to remember if I had brought it in myself. But I had not eaten in the living room the night before. I picked it up carefully, as if it might sting me. My fingers trembled as I walked it back to the kitchen. I opened the camera footage from the night before. Around 3 a.m., the motion sensor in the kitchen had triggered. The video showed nothing. No person, no animal, just the kitchen as it had been. Then the living room camera caught a flicker, a blur for a brief second. It wasn't enough to make out anything clearly. It looked like a glitch, but I knew better. I sat down and made a decision. I couldn't keep living in fear. I wasn't going to be a prisoner in my own home. I called a friend who worked in private security. He came by, helped me check every part of the house again. This time we found something. Inside the crawl space behind the laundry room, hidden under a loose panel, we found a small pile of items. A notepad, a pen, a cracked phone, and an empty water bottle. Someone had been staying there, quietly, carefully, unnoticed. I couldn't believe it. The space was cramped and dark, not fit for anyone to live in. But the evidence was clear. Someone had been inside my house. We handed everything over to the authorities, This time they took it seriously. An investigation began, and they installed their own surveillance. A few nights later, they caught the intruder on camera, slipping through a basement window I hadn't known could be pried open. They arrested them on the spot. The person was taken in for questioning. They had been squatting in the crawl space for at least 2 weeks, watching, moving things subtly, avoiding detection. It was their way of testing boundaries, playing games. Nothing had been stolen, but they admitted they liked rearranging things to see if I would notice. It was a twisted thrill. I was shaken, but also relieved. The fear that had gripped me for days finally had a face, a name, a reason. It didn't make the experience any easier, but it brought closure. I reinforced every entry point in the house. The cameras stayed, the lights stayed, and I learned to trust my instincts more than ever before. Life slowly returned to normal. The rearranged items stopped. The house felt like mine again. I kept a few habits from that time, like double-checking locks and keeping the security app open. But I also regained my peace. I had faced something deeply disturbing, but I came out stronger, more aware, and more careful than before. Story 5. I was not expecting much from the evening, just a simple blind date arranged by a friend who swore it would be good for me. I had been working a lot, buried in routines and tasks, and thought maybe a night out with someone new might be a decent change. The plan was to meet at a small lounge downtown, a place I had never been to before, but that looked calm and cozy online. I got there early to shake off the nerves, scanning the quiet room lit by soft lamps. I picked a booth near the back, ordered a glass of water first, and waited. The person showed up right on time, dressed nicely, carrying an easy smile. There was a quick conversation, some polite questions, and the usual small talk. We ordered drinks and I asked for something light, just enough to relax. Mine arrived first, a pale-colored cocktail with a slice of lime on the rim. I took a few small sips, not thinking anything of it. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something was off. My head began to feel unusually light, not the usual buzz that comes from a drink. My thoughts slowed down, and I found it harder to focus on the conversation. I blinked several times, trying to shake the haze, but it only seemed to thicken. My skin felt clammy, and I had a strange metallic taste in my mouth. I excused myself and headed toward the restroom, gripping the back of a chair along the way for support. My legs felt unstable, and the hallway seemed to stretch too far. I managed to get to the restroom and lock the door behind me, my hands shaking. I stared at myself in the mirror, watching my pupils dilate unevenly. That was the moment the fear hit hard and fast. Something was terribly wrong. Leaning against the sink, I focused on breathing and tried to stay upright. I splashed cold water on my face, but it did little to clear the dizziness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I reached for it slowly, trying to steady my vision enough to call someone. I scrolled past messages and finally found the number of the friend who had set up the date. I managed to hit call and muttered a few shaky words before slipping to the floor. I do not remember much after that, just flashes of noise and movement. Voices echoed in my ears, and lights blurred across my vision. I felt someone shaking me lightly, then the jolt of a cold surface beneath me. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital room, the ceiling lights above steady and white. A nurse was checking my pulse, and a police officer stood quietly in the corner. A doctor came in after a few minutes and explained that my drink had likely been drugged. The symptoms matched a common substance used in cases like this, one that acted fast and faded quickly, Luckily, the small amount I had ingested was not enough to do serious harm, especially since I had not finished the drink. I was monitored overnight, and by morning I felt physically stable again, though mentally I was a mess. The reality of what had almost happened weighed heavily. The officer spoke with me once I had gathered enough strength. I told them everything I remembered, from the first sip to the moment I called my friend. They took notes, asked for a description, and promised to investigate. I did not know what would come of it, but I was grateful I had realized something was wrong before it was too late. My friend had arrived quickly, panicked but alert, and their quick thinking might have saved me. Over the next few days, I went through waves of emotions. Anger came first, followed by confusion, and then deep sadness. I had only wanted a quiet night, maybe a few laughs and a new connection. Instead, I had been targeted by someone with dark intentions, someone who had smiled and made small talk while planning something cruel. It took me a while to sleep through the night without waking in panic. I changed some routines after that. I avoided going out alone for a while and stopped accepting drinks I had not watched being made. I told people close to me what had happened, not because I wanted pity, but because I thought they should know. Some had stories of their own, close calls or frightening moments they had kept quiet. That made me feel less alone, but more aware of how common this could be. The police eventually contacted me again. They had reviewed security footage from the lounge and identified the person I had been with. It turned out they had done this before, and mine was not the first report. With enough evidence now collected, the person was arrested and charged. The relief I felt was heavy and real, though it did not erase what had happened. It helped knowing that person could not do this to someone else. I spent some time in counseling after that, something I never thought I would need. But it helped. Talking about it with someone trained to understand trauma gave me space to breathe. I stopped blaming myself for letting my guard down. I started seeing it as something someone else had done to me, not something I had brought upon myself. Months passed before I went on another date. Even then, I met them in a public place during the afternoon with friends nearby just in case. I watched my drink like a hawk, and I made sure my phone was fully charged before I left the house. It was not ideal, and it felt like something important had been taken from me. But I was still here, still standing, still capable of joy. Looking back, I see how lucky I was. I reacted quickly, trusted my instincts, and had people who cared enough to come when I needed them. I never thought I would be the type of person to experience something like that. It changed the way I view the world, made me more careful, more alert. But it also showed me that strength comes in quiet choices, like calling for help, walking away, or speaking up afterward. In the end, I chose to keep living fully. I would not let one cruel act steal my courage or ruin my peace. There are good people out there, and not every evening ends in fear. I found comfort in my routines again, and slowly the tension in my shoulders eased. I still remember that night, but I remember more clearly the strength I found afterward. Story 6. I had been driving for hours, the kind of drive that blurs the line between day and night. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with trucks, fast food signs, and occasional exit ramps leading to sleepy towns. I was exhausted, not just physically but mentally, and my eyes ached from squinting at the road. When I finally spotted a highway rest stop, it felt like relief. The lights in the distance were like a beacon, and all I could think about was using the restroom and getting back on the road. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars and 2 large transport trucks parked in the far corner. I pulled into a spot near the building and turned off the engine. The rest stop looked clean and well maintained, with bright fluorescent lights illuminating the exterior. Inside, it was quiet except for the soft hum of vending machines and the occasional flush from the restrooms. I made my way toward the women's restroom, feeling the full weight of fatigue pressing on my shoulders. The restroom was well lit, with beige-tiled walls and the smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. There were several stalls, most of them empty, and a long mirror above the sinks. I chose the second stall from the end, closed the door, and locked it. As I sat down, I leaned back slightly, letting out a long breath. My head throbbed with the stress of the long trip, and I was eager to finish and get back on the road before it got too late. Then I noticed it. A faint movement below the stall divider caught my eye. At first I thought it was a bag or something someone had dropped, but when I looked again I realized what it was. A phone, facing upward, with the camera lens aimed directly into my stall. I froze, my stomach flipping in disbelief. My heart pounded as I stared at the small, dark rectangle on the floor just inches away. The phone didn't move for a second, but then it shifted slightly, as if whoever was holding it had adjusted their grip. I snapped into action, standing up and kicking my foot at the phone. It clattered away quickly, pulled back under the divider and out of sight. I could hear the sound of hurried footsteps leaving the restroom and the outer door slamming shut. My hands shook as I adjusted my clothes and pushed open the stall door. I rushed out into the main hallway of the rest stop, scanning the area. There were a few people around, mostly looking at snacks or stretching near the vending machines. I looked toward the parking lot, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone leaving in a hurry, but there was nothing obvious. No one stood out. I debated chasing after whoever it was, but I realized I had no clear description. All I had seen was the phone. My mind raced. I felt violated, angry, and confused. I walked over to the front desk, where an attendant sat behind a plexiglass window. I explained what happened, trying to stay calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my body. The attendant nodded, his expression serious, and said he would check the security cameras. He asked me to wait while he contacted someone to assist. For minutes felt like hours as I sat near the entrance, staring at the parking lot through the glass doors. Eventually, a security officer arrived and asked me to describe everything. I told him about the phone, the stall, and the moment I kicked at it. He took notes and asked if I had seen the person's face. I shook my head, frustrated. I had not seen anything but that phone, that quiet device stealing a moment I thought was private. The officer walked me back to the restroom, and we both checked the area. There was no phone, no sign of the person. I tried to remember details about the shoes or clothing, but I had been too shocked to register anything clearly. The officer reassured me that they would pull footage from the outside cameras and log the incident. He advised me to file a report with local authorities as well, just in case. I walked back to my car feeling numb. The safety I once associated with public spaces felt like it had been stripped away. I sat there in silence, staring at the dashboard, trying to calm myself. I thought about how often I had used public restrooms without a second thought. Now, that innocence was gone. I checked my rearview mirror several times before pulling out of the lot, scanning the road behind me like I was being followed. The rest of the drive was tense. Every rest stop I passed, I ignored. I held everything in, determined to reach a familiar town where I could stop safely. When I finally found a small motel just off the highway, I pulled in and parked. Inside the room, I sat on the edge of the bed, replaying the event over and over in my head. I thought about the angle of the camera, the way it had been positioned, and how deliberate the act had been. The next morning, I went to the local police station and filed a report. The officer at the front desk listened carefully and promised they would follow up with the highway patrol and the rest stops management. I gave every detail I could remember, no matter how small. It felt like something I had to do, not just for myself but for anyone else who might use that restroom in the future. I left the station feeling slightly more empowered, like I had taken back some control. Days passed, and I got a call from the highway authority. They had reviewed the security footage from the rest stop and confirmed that a person had been seen entering the restroom around the same time I did, then exiting hurriedly. The person was caught on camera but had kept their head down. Still, the footage had been forwarded to local law enforcement, and an investigation was underway. They thanked me for reporting the incident and encouraged me to follow up if I had any more information. Over time, I began to feel like myself again. The initial fear and anxiety began to fade, replaced by caution and awareness. I started carrying a small flashlight and a noise alarm on my keychain. I made it a habit to check public restrooms before using them, scanning the stalls for anything suspicious. I realized that one disturbing encounter did not have to control my life, but it had changed the way I saw the world. Eventually, I heard back from law enforcement that the person had been identified and apprehended. It turned out he had been caught in a similar incident at another rest stop just days later. The police were able to match his car to the footage from the cameras and tracked him down. Knowing that justice had been served gave me peace. It did not erase what happened, but it closed the chapter. I continued with my travels, always alert but never paralyzed by fear. I told friends and family about what happened, not to scare them, but to remind them to stay aware. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and I refused to let it be a secret. I learned to trust my instincts, to act quickly, and to speak up when something felt wrong. It took a while, but I reclaimed the confidence that had been shaken. I reminded myself that what happened was not my fault. I had the right to privacy and dignity, just like anyone else. That experience, as awful as it was, taught me the importance of being vigilant and speaking out. I moved forward, stronger and more aware, knowing I had taken the right steps and that I was not alone. Story 7. It was a little past midnight when I heard the knock. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I paused the movie I was watching and sat still, waiting for another sound. When the knock came again, firmer this time, I stood up and made my way slowly to the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the hour alone made me cautious. I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole. A person stood on the other side, shifting from one foot to the other. Their expression looked panicked, like they were afraid or in pain. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the lock. They knocked again, this time calling out for help, their voice cracked and desperate. Against my better judgment, I unlatched the door but kept the chain on. The chain only allowed the door to open a few inches, just enough for me to see their face clearly. They said they had been in an accident and needed to use a phone. I asked if they had a phone of their own, and they replied that it had been broken when they fell. Something about their story didn't sit right, but their voice trembled and their eyes darted around nervously. It was hard to tell if it was fear or something else entirely. I told them to wait and that I would call for help, and their expression changed almost immediately. The fear disappeared and was replaced by something colder, and they leaned into the door, pressing against it hard enough to make the chain stretch. "Just let me in," they said, the tone of their voice suddenly commanding instead of pleading. I stepped back, slamming the door shut before they could try to force it further open. I locked the door and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining what had happened. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me while they sent someone out. I kept all the lights on and moved away from the windows, listening for any sound outside. The knocking had stopped, but I was too afraid to check the peephole again. I waited for what felt like forever, clutching the phone tightly. When the police arrived, they checked around the house and the nearby area. They found footprints in the dirt outside the porch, but no sign of the person who had knocked. They told me it was good that I had not opened the door fully and warned me to be careful, especially at night. They didn't find any evidence of an accident, no damaged vehicle, no blood, nothing. After giving my statement, they left, promising to patrol the area for the rest of the night. I barely slept. Every sound seemed louder than usual, and I kept checking the locks every hour. I couldn't shake the look in that person's eyes when their expression had changed. It wasn't just fear or confusion. It was calculated. I had almost let someone dangerous into my home. The thought made my skin crawl. I was thankful I had kept the chain on the door. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from the security camera above my door. The person had approached the house slowly, looking around before knocking. They never showed signs of being hurt or limping. In fact, they had paced a little before knocking again, like they were preparing for something. I saved the footage and forwarded it to the police, hoping it might help if they showed up somewhere else. For the next few days, I stayed on edge. I avoided going out at night and kept my curtains closed. Friends who heard about the incident checked in, and a few offered to stay over for a while. I declined, but their concern helped me feel a little less isolated. I installed extra locks and a better security system. I couldn't stop the fear completely, but I wanted to feel some sense of control again. A week passed without incident. I tried to settle back into my routine, though I still found myself looking over my shoulder more than usual. One evening, I came home to find a small envelope slid under my door. There was no name, no return address. Inside was a piece of paper that read, "You were smart." My stomach dropped. I called the police again and handed over the note. They took the envelope for fingerprints but didn't find anything helpful. They suggested the person might have been testing houses, looking for someone gullible enough to open the door. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had removed the chain. It chilled me to my core. I made the decision to invest in reinforced doors and cameras for the back of the house, too. Over time, things slowly started to feel normal again. I never heard any updates from the police, but I also never saw the stranger again. Still, I stayed careful. I talked to my neighbors more and joined a local safety group that shared alerts about suspicious activity. Knowing I wasn't the only one paying attention helped ease my mind. The months went by, and eventually, I no longer jumped at every knock or shadow outside the window. I still kept the chain on at night and made sure to look before answering. The fear turned into awareness, something that stayed with me quietly rather than taking over my life. I didn't want to live in fear, but I had learned the importance of trusting my instincts. One afternoon, I ran into an officer who had been one of the first responders that night. He remembered me and asked if everything had been calm since then. I nodded and thanked him again for their help. Before we parted ways, he said something that stuck with me. "You listen to your gut. A lot of people don't. That's probably what kept you safe." That night I sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the street. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. I had faced something dangerous and managed to protect myself without losing my sense of self. It reminded me that caution is not weakness, and awareness can be a form of strength. I would never forget that night, but I also would not let it define me. I was still here, still strong, and always ready. Story 8. I had not seen this friend in over a year, so when I got the invitation to their housewarming party, I was both surprised and curious. We had drifted apart over time, but I still remembered our good moments together. The idea of reconnecting seemed harmless enough, especially in a setting that felt casual and festive. The party was scheduled for the evening, and I arrived just before 7 p.m., bringing along a small houseplant as a gift. The neighborhood was quiet, the house was modern and freshly painted, and everything on the outside looked completely normal. The front door opened to warm greetings and upbeat music echoing through the hallway. I stepped in and handed over the plant, exchanging a quick hug and a few friendly words. Inside, the place was buzzing with people I vaguely recognized from past gatherings, and some I had never seen before. Laughter, drinks, and the smell of catered food filled the air. It felt like the kind of event where nothing could go wrong, where everyone had come just to unwind and celebrate. As the night wore on, I mingled with different groups and sipped from a cup of something sweet and fizzy. Small talk flowed easily, but I could not help noticing that my friends seemed slightly distracted. Every time someone asked about certain parts of the house, like the back rooms or the garage, they quickly changed the subject. At first I brushed it off, assuming they just wanted to keep some areas private. But the more I observed, the more deliberate it felt. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I wandered off on my own, pretending to be looking for the bathroom. The hallway stretched into a more dimly lit section of the house, far from the sound of music and conversation. I passed a guest room and a small office before reaching a door that stood out. It was locked, the only one in the hallway that had a bolt instead of a regular knob. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to push further. Just as I turned to head back, I saw a small set of keys sitting on a side table near the wall. I glanced around, made sure no one was watching, then picked them up. My fingers hesitated at the lock, but something pushed me forward. When I turned the key, there was a soft click, and the door creaked open. I slipped inside and closed it quietly behind me. The room was colder than the rest of the house, dimly lit by the soft blue glow of multiple screens. I stood frozen as my eyes adjusted. Monitors lined the walls, showing live feeds from various angles inside the house, outside the property, even places that seemed public, like cafes and city streets. Some screens showed locations I had never seen, while others were clearly familiar spots in our town. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. The walls were covered in notes, maps, and photographs. Some of the photos had faces circled in red ink. There were names, locations, times scribbled next to them. One monitor displayed a feed of a bedroom that looked eerily like mine. I leaned closer, noticing the furniture, the curtains, even the chipped corner of the dresser. It was unmistakably my room. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled back, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I had been. I had so many questions, but the most immediate was why. Why would someone I once trusted go through this trouble? What were they collecting all this for? There were drawers beneath the monitors filled with flash drives, documents, and what looked like hard drives. The level of detail and planning was overwhelming. I wanted to believe this was all part of some elaborate security system, but nothing about it felt like protection. It felt like control. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, careful to get shots of the screens and the documents. I knew I could not confront anyone here and now, not without putting myself at risk. As quietly as I had entered, I stepped out of the room and locked it again. I returned the keys to the table and made my way back to the living room, forcing a smile as I grabbed my coat and made excuses about needing to leave early. The ride home felt surreal. I kept replaying what I had seen, trying to piece together a reason behind it all. I considered whether I should contact someone, report it, or even confront my friend. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed to be careful. Whoever set that room up had gone through a lot of effort to keep it hidden. They were watching people, maybe even blackmailing them. I had no idea how deep it went. I spent that night unable to sleep, jumping at every noise and checking my own apartment for hidden cameras. The idea that someone had been watching me in my most private moments was terrifying. I went over everything I had ever told that friend, every time they had visited, wondering when and how they had set it up. I checked my smoke detectors, my picture frames, even the vents. I found nothing, but it did not make me feel safer. The next day, I took the photos I had taken and went straight to the police. I told them everything, from the invitation to what I had found. They listened carefully and asked a lot of questions. I handed over the images, and they took them seriously. An investigation began, and I was asked to keep quiet about it while they looked into the matter. I agreed, knowing that drawing attention could be dangerous. Weeks went by, and I received occasional updates. The authorities had found evidence that matched what I had seen. Several people were being monitored through illegal surveillance, and more evidence was being gathered. I kept my distance from that friend, never making contact, never returning to the neighborhood. It felt like a strange betrayal, being spied on by someone I once shared good memories with. Eventually, arrests were made. The news covered the story briefly, mentioning illegal surveillance and privacy violations, but kept most details confidential. I was relieved, though a part of me still felt unsettled. The idea that someone could set up an entire operation like that without anyone knowing made me see the world differently. I started being more cautious, more aware of where I went and who I trusted. I moved apartments a few months later, choosing a place where I had more control over the environment. I learned about hidden camera detectors and privacy laws, arming myself with knowledge I wished I had before. What started as a simple housewarming visit had pulled me into something much darker, but in the end, speaking up had made a difference. It stopped something dangerous from continuing. Looking back, I am grateful I listened to my instincts. Curiosity might have led me into that room, but it was courage that pushed me to report it. I never imagined I would be involved in something like that, but I am glad I acted. The experience changed how I live, how I connect with others, and how I protect my own space. Some friendships are not what they seem, and sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and do what is right. Story 9. The evening air was cold as I walked down the dimly lit street, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that made me uneasy, like the calm before a storm. I had just finished running a few errands and I was heading home, my mind preoccupied with the day's events. I didn't notice him at first, the man following me, his steps matching mine as I walked. It wasn't until I turned a corner that I became aware of his presence, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I quickened my pace, but so did he. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his face was hidden behind a plain white mask. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. My heart began to race as I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that maybe he was just another person out for a late-night walk. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I glanced behind me again, and there he was, still trailing just a few steps behind, never closing the distance but never letting it grow either. The mask he wore was featureless, like something you would find at a costume shop, and it made his presence even more unsettling. I couldn't see his expression, but I could feel that he was there, watching me. I tried to remain calm, but the anxiety was building inside me, gnawing at my insides. At the next corner, I turned sharply and tried to walk faster. But again, his steps were right there, mirroring mine. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me on purpose, that he had been doing it for longer than I realized. It was as though he was waiting for the right moment to do something I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. My mind raced as I looked around, trying to find a way to escape. I spotted a small convenience store a few yards ahead and made a snap decision. I didn't care if I had to buy something or not. I just needed to get inside and away from this man. I walked faster, my breath coming in short bursts, as I reached for the door. I pushed it open quickly, stepping inside and letting the door close behind me. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh, and the hum of the freezer units was the only sound. The clerk behind the counter, a middle-aged man with glasses, looked up as I entered. He gave me a curious glance but didn't say anything. I glanced over my shoulder through the front window, but I didn't see the man anymore. I let out a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. Something didn't feel right. I turned back to the clerk and asked, "Is there a back exit to this store?" The clerk looked at me with a knowing expression, almost as though he had seen this happen before. "You're not the first one," he said, his voice low. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The clerk didn't respond right away. Instead, he motioned toward the back of the store, then nodded toward the window. "You're not the first person he's followed," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot. Happens all the time." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid that even speaking it out loud would bring him back into view. The clerk sighed and pushed his glasses up his nose. "I don't know much, just that he's been coming around here for a while. Always the same, wearing that mask, following people, never speaking. Some people have gotten scared enough to call 911, but when they arrive, he's gone." My pulse quickened as I processed his words. This wasn't a random occurrence, but something that had happened before. The mask-wearing man wasn't just following me. He had been doing this to others too. "Does he ever do anything?" I asked, not sure if I wanted to know the answer. The clerk shrugged. "He just follows. That's all he does. Walks behind people, never gets too close. But the people he follows, they get scared, they get nervous, and that's when they come in here or do something else. He never forces anyone to do anything. It's like he's watching them, waiting for something." The words hung in the air, heavy with a sense of dread. I felt a cold sweat bead on my forehead. What did he want? What was his purpose? Why was he following me? I stood frozen for a moment, processing the information. The idea of someone following me, someone who had done it before to other people, made my skin crawl. "Has anyone ever caught him?" I asked, feeling desperate for some sort of answer. The clerk nodded slowly. "A few people have tried, but he's quick. When they confront him, he just walks away, vanishes into the night. No one's been able to track him down, no one's been able to stop him." His voice was tinged with frustration, as if he had witnessed this too many times to count. I felt a rising sense of panic, and I could feel my hands trembling. What was I supposed to do? If this man had been following others, and nothing had been done about it, was I just supposed to let him keep following me too? What if he came back for me once I left the store? The thought of him lurking outside, waiting for me to leave, made my stomach turn. I glanced toward the door again, half expecting to see him standing there watching. But the street outside appeared empty. The city, still quiet, seemed like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I looked back at the clerk, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you have a phone I can use?" I asked. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then nodded and handed me the store's phone. I quickly dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained the situation. I told them about the man in the mask, how he had been following me, how I had ducked into the store to get away from him. The operator assured me they would send someone to check it out, but when I looked at the time, I realized it had already been over 20 minutes since I first noticed him following me. I hung up the phone and turned back toward the clerk. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to stay in the store, to wait for the authorities to show up and handle it. But the other part of me wanted to leave, to try to get home as quickly as possible, hoping that the man wouldn't follow me again. Before I could make a decision, the door to the store jingled, and I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat. A man stepped inside, but it wasn't the same man. This one was just an ordinary person, and I could see the relief on the clerk's face as the tension in the store seemed to dissipate. I looked around again, feeling a little foolish. Had it all been in my head? Was I just overreacting? But as I left the store and stepped back into the cold night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The man in the mask was still out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows. Story 10. What? I had been babysitting for the same wealthy family for months, and I was used to their routines. Look, they were kind, paid well, and I enjoyed the time I spent with the children. The parents were always very particular about their privacy, and the house itself was enormous, full of rooms I had never been inside. It was the kind of place that felt a little too grand for a normal family, with its tall ceilings, polished floors, and long hallways lined with portraits of distant relatives. Most of my time was spent in the living room or the children's bedrooms, but I'd often found myself wandering the house, admiring the decor and wondering about the lives of the people who lived there. One night, after putting the children to bed, I found myself with some free time, as usual. The parents had gone out for a dinner event, and I had the place to myself. It was quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the house's air conditioning. I settled into the living room, planning to catch up on some reading. The house was always so still at night, almost too still. It had an eerie, empty feeling, but I thought nothing of it at the time. I stood up to stretch, glancing around the room when something caught my eye. A large bookshelf stood against the far wall, almost blending in with the rest of the room. It was lined with thick, old books, most of which looked untouched. As I walked closer to the bookshelf, I noticed that one of the books seemed out of place. It wasn't like the others, with its spine worn and its cover cracked. But curiosity got the better of me, and I reached for it, pulling it out of its place. To my surprise, the book wasn't just a book, it was a lever. I paused for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was no way it could be real, right? A lever disguised as a book. But sure enough, when I gave it a slight tug, the bookshelf began to move. The sound of it scraping against the wall made my heart race, and I quickly took a step back. The bookshelf swung open to reveal a narrow, dark hallway that stretched farther than I could see. My first instinct was to close it, to pretend I had never touched it, but something held me there, something far more curious than I should have been. I stood frozen, staring into the dark space beyond the bookshelf. The air in the hallway was thick with dust, and the temperature dropped the moment the door opened. But it felt like stepping into another world, one that had been forgotten for years. I wondered if the family even knew about it, or if they had purposely kept it hidden. I could hear the faint sound of my breathing, and my heart beat faster with every passing second. It was all too much, but my curiosity won out. I couldn't just walk away. I took a step into the dark hallway, the sound of my footfall muffled by the old carpeting that lined the floor. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk through comfortably. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the ceiling was low. It felt like a place that had been abandoned for a long time, even though I knew the family had lived in the house for years. The further I went, the darker it became, the only light coming from the small slivers of space between the shifting bookshelf door. At the end of the hallway was a door old and weathered, with a lock that looked far too complicated for something so hidden. I felt my pulse quicken. What was behind that door? What was so secret that it needed to be locked away? I had no idea, but the temptation to find out was overwhelming. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling as I grasped it. The door opened with a groan, revealing a room that was unlike anything I had expected. The room was small, tucked away in the farthest corner of the house, and it smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired in years. It was barely furnished, with only a few pieces of old furniture covered in dust. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they were filled with strange objects, old photographs, antique dolls, and objects that seemed to belong to another time. It was a collection, but it wasn't a collection of anything normal. There were things that didn't make sense, things that made my skin crawl just by looking at them. I stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. The room felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. But at the same time, I couldn't turn away. My eyes moved from one object to the next, taking in the strange and unsettling items that filled the space. I saw a faded photograph of a family I didn't recognize, their faces blurred by time. I saw dolls with glass eyes that seemed to stare back at me, their heads turned in unnatural angles. And then there were the books, thick, old volumes that looked like they belonged to another era, filled with strange symbols and words I couldn't understand. I had no idea what any of this meant, but I felt like I had uncovered something I wasn't meant to. My hands trembled as I reached for one of the books. The cover was embossed with a symbol I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, the pages were filled with illustrations that seemed to move. They shifted and twisted in a way that didn't seem possible, as though they were alive. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I heard a sound. A soft shuffle, followed by a low voice. I froze, my blood running cold. Someone else was in the room with me. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around, but there was no one there. The voice was faint, like a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The door I had come through was still open, but I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate, paralyzed by fear and the knowledge that I wasn't alone. I backed out of the room, careful not to make a sound, and closed the door behind me. The hallway was just as I had left it, dark and quiet. I didn't know what I had just discovered, but I felt like I was on the edge of something much bigger than I could comprehend. I didn't want to know anymore. I didn't want to know what the family was hiding, what was behind that door, or why it had been kept a secret for so long. I quickly returned to the living room, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just uncovered something dangerous. The whole experience felt like a dream, one that I couldn't wake up from. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, but it was no use. My mind kept going back to that room, to the strange items and the voice I had heard. What had I stumbled upon? And what would happen if the family found out I had been there? I never spoke of it to anyone, not even the parents when they returned. The next few times I babysat for them, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to the house. I avoided the bookshelf, avoided the hallway, and never went near the locked room again. I couldn't forget what I had seen, but I also knew that some things were better left alone. And as time passed, I realized that some secrets are meant to stay hidden, no matter how much we want to know the truth. Story 11. When I first moved into the shared apartment, everything seemed normal. I was excited to start a new chapter in my life, living in a big city where I had the opportunity to meet new people and experience new things. The apartment was spacious enough with shared living spaces, and I was assigned one of the smaller bedrooms. My roommates seemed friendly enough. They introduced themselves, and we exchanged pleasantries. It felt like a good fit for me at the time. The first few weeks went by without incident. My roommates and I shared meals occasionally, and we would chat about our days. One roommate in particular seemed to take an interest in me, often asking personal questions that seemed to go a little too deep for casual conversation. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, everyone is curious when they are getting to know someone. However, after a while, I started to notice something odd about their behavior. It was subtle at first. They would mention things about my day or things I hadn't told anyone. I assumed they were just observant, or that I had mentioned something in passing and they remembered it. But then, one day, while cleaning my room, I accidentally knocked over a stack of books that had been pushed under my bed. As I picked them up, I noticed a small notebook that I hadn't seen before. The cover was plain, just a simple black hardcover. Curious, I opened it. The first page caught me off guard. It was filled with detailed notes, not about themselves, but about me. They wrote about things I had done, places I had been, and conversations I had with other roommates. The details were so specific that I wondered how they could possibly know them. It was almost like they had been observing me, taking mental notes of my every move. As I turned more pages, I was hit with a sense of dread. The notes weren't just casual observations, they were plans, detailed plans that involved me. It was at that moment that I realized how little I truly knew about this person. The entries were filled with dates and times, as though they were mapping out my schedule. There were plans for when I would leave for work, when I would be home, and even times I had spoken to other people. Some entries were more disturbing. They wrote about where I would go on weekends, who I interacted with, and how I reacted in certain situations. It wasn't just harmless curiosity, it felt invasive. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My stomach twisted in knots as I read more. The pages became more personal, more obsessive. At one point, there was a note that seemed to suggest that I might be in danger if I left for too long. It mentioned that I would feel isolated when I got back, as though they were trying to control where I went and how long I stayed away. There was even a specific mention of my phone calls with family, things that were never discussed in front of anyone else. I felt sick to my stomach, as though my privacy had been completely invaded. The journal had detailed plans for how I would interact with the other roommates, where I would sit at the dinner table, and even when I would leave the apartment for grocery shopping. I was horrified by the thought that this person was carefully crafting a narrative around my life, trying to shape the way I behaved and interacted with others. It was like they saw themselves as the orchestrator of my existence, guiding me through the motions of my daily life. I quickly shoved the notebook back under the bed and stood frozen in place. I felt a surge of panic and confusion. Should I confront them about this? Should I pack up and leave? The thoughts raced through my mind, and my heart pounded in my chest. But then, as I stood there, I heard footsteps approaching the door. I quickly closed the door to my room and sat on the bed, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was spinning, but I knew I needed to act carefully. The next few days were a blur. I tried to go about my usual routine, pretending everything was normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered. Every time I passed that roommate, I could feel their eyes on me, like they were watching my every move. It was unsettling, to say the least. I started to second-guess everything I did. Were they following me? Were they planning something? The paranoia set in, and I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I couldn't sleep properly anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pages of that journal, the words that detailed my life as if I were some kind of experiment. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to confront them, but I didn't know how. The thought of confronting them made my skin crawl, but I couldn't continue to live in fear. I decided to try and keep my distance, avoiding unnecessary interactions with that roommate as much as possible. One evening, after a long day at work, I came back to the apartment to find the other roommates hanging out in the living room. They didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but my eyes kept darting to the door of that roommate's room. I had no idea what they were doing behind that door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I debated whether I should take a more direct approach and confront them, but fear held me back. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. I started to notice more subtle signs that this person was becoming more invasive. They would ask about my day in ways that felt rehearsed, as though they were checking off a list of things to ask me. When I went to the kitchen, I would often find them there, staring at me with a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. It was clear that they knew too much about me, and it made me feel trapped. One evening, I made the decision to leave. I packed my bags quietly, careful not to draw attention to myself. As I left the apartment, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. I had no idea what was going on in that apartment, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to get away from that person, from the suffocating feeling that they were controlling my every move. When I left, I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was heading, but knowing that I couldn't go back. I eventually found a small, quiet place to stay. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. I kept a low profile, changed my phone number, and started over. The apartment, the roommates, the journal, it all became a distant memory. As time went on, I started to feel a sense of freedom again. I was no longer under anyone's control. and I no longer had to look over my shoulder every time I stepped outside. But I couldn't forget what had happened. That journal haunted me for a long time. I never found out what their true intentions were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been planning something far more sinister. I never looked back. I had learned my lesson. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Story 12. I had just finished a long day at work and was heading to the ATM to withdraw some cash before heading home. It was late in the evening, around 9 p.m., and the streets were relatively empty. I approached the machine and noticed that there was someone standing near it, a man who appeared to be fiddling with his phone. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I stepped closer, I realized he wasn't just using his phone. He was actually looking at the screen with a sense of urgency, almost as if he was waiting for something. I thought it was strange, but again, I didn't pay much attention and went to the machine. I inserted my card into the slot, the screen lit up, and I began the usual process. The machine prompted me to place my finger on the biometric scanner for identity verification. I placed my finger on the scanner, waiting for the familiar green light to appear, signaling that my fingerprint had been recognized. It was at that moment I noticed something odd. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man move closer, still engrossed in his phone, but now his eyes were trained on the scanner. I instinctively looked at him, but he quickly averted his gaze. It struck me as unusual, but I didn't think much of it. Odd. The scanner beeped, confirming that my fingerprint had been verified, and the transaction options appeared on the screen. I proceeded to choose my withdrawal amount, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at the man again, only to see him now standing right behind me, pretending to fiddle with his phone once more. His presence was too close for comfort, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. I finished the transaction as quickly as I could, grabbed my cash, and turned to leave. As I walked away from the ATM, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and his strange behavior. There had been something about his actions that didn't sit right with me. The way he had kept his eyes fixed on the biometric scanner, his movements too deliberate, it was almost as if he had been waiting for me to use the machine. It wasn't until I was halfway home that the thought crossed my mind. Had he been trying to clone my fingerprint? The idea seemed absurd at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The biometric scanner had been the only security feature that would have allowed him to gain access to my account. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I tried to shake off the suspicion. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild after a long day. But as the hours passed, I couldn't let go of the nagging feeling that something had gone wrong. I decided to check my bank account online just to make sure nothing unusual had happened. When I logged in, my heart sank. There was a transaction listed that I hadn't made. Someone had attempted to withdraw a large amount of money from my account just minutes after I had used the ATM. My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen. There was no doubt in my mind now. Someone had been trying to clone my fingerprint. I immediately called my bank's customer service hotline and reported the issue. They told me they would block my account and initiate an investigation into the unauthorized transaction. They also advised me to change my PIN and any other security measures tied to my account. As I hung up, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could something like this happen? The ATM was supposed to be one of the most secure methods of withdrawing money, with biometric verification to prevent fraud. But it seemed that someone had found a way around it. From that point forward, I kept a closer eye on the little things. I trusted my instincts more and paid attention when something felt off. I did not become fearful or isolated. I just became smarter and more cautious. It was not a bad thing to be careful. I began enjoying my daily routines again, going to the store without hesitation and taking weekend drives without checking under the car first. The fear that once clung to everything I did finally began to fade. I even returned some of the smart devices to my home, more aware now of how to control their settings. Life felt normal again, or at least a better version of normal. Looking back, I still do not know who placed that tracker. But I do know that it did not break me. It did not take away my strength or ability to live freely. I turned the experience into something that helped me grow. That felt like the best ending I could ask for. Story 16. The job was not glamorous, but it paid the bills. I worked alone most days, cleaning out foreclosed homes that had been left to decay. Sometimes it was just dust and cobwebs. Other times it was furniture, forgotten clothes, and the occasional box of personal belongings that made me feel like I was intruding on someone's memories. I learned quickly to keep my emotions out of it, to get in clean and get out. The faster I finished, the sooner I could move on to the next property. This house sat at the edge of town, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes and tall grass. The windows were boarded up, and the front door had been busted open before I arrived. The inside was musty, filled with the smell of mildew and rot. I wore gloves and a mask as I worked, pushing through the grime and layers of dust. The place was quiet, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling under my feet. Everything was going as usual until I reached the hallway near the kitchen and noticed the basement door. It stood out because it had fresh locks, not one, but two, and the metal gleamed under the weak light from the hallway. The rest of the house was falling apart, but this door looked like someone had put effort into securing it recently. That was not standard in foreclosures. I paused, staring at it for a moment before continuing with the cleaning. I tried not to think about it, but every time I passed by that hallway, the door seemed to draw my attention. Then, around noon, I heard something. It was soft at first, like a tap or shuffle. I stopped and held my breath, listening. A second later, I heard it again, this time louder, a distinct thump followed by a scraping sound from behind the basement door. My stomach tightened, and I backed away without meaning to. Logic told me it could be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a rat trapped down there. But animals did not install locks. They did not secure doors from the inside. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide whether to call someone or just finish my job and leave. The instructions were always the same. Clean what I could, report what I could not. Do not engage. That had never been a problem before. I walked back to the front of the house and sat in the van to think. The idea of calling the police crossed my mind, but what would I even say? There were noises in a locked basement, and I had no proof of anything beyond my own unease. So I waited. I ate a sandwich, drank some water, and hoped the house would settle back into silence. After about 20 minutes, I went back in. The house felt colder. The air had shifted, or maybe I had just let my nerves take over. I returned to work, avoiding the hallway with the basement door, focusing instead on the living room and the upstairs bedrooms. It was not until I came back downstairs that I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. A voice, muffled but definitely human. I froze, heart racing, and moved closer to the door. The locks were still in place. Nothing had been tampered with. I knocked on the door before I could stop myself. The sound that came back was desperate. A series of loud bangs and what I could only assume were words, though I could not make any of them out clearly. It sounded like someone was begging. That was enough. I pulled out my phone and called for help. The dispatcher took my information and said someone would be there soon. I stayed outside, pacing in the driveway, watching the front door like it might explode open at any second. It took about 20 minutes for the police to arrive. I showed them the basement door, explained what I heard, and stepped back while they worked to break the locks. It took them a few tries, but eventually the door creaked open. A rush of cold air came up the stairs, followed by the faint scent of something foul and metallic. The officers went down first, flashlights in hand. I waited at the top of the stairs, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. After a few minutes, one of them called up that it was safe. I followed slowly, one step at a time, unsure what I was about to see. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and debris. In the far corner was a small room built with cinder blocks and plywood. Inside that room was a man, filthy, dehydrated, and shaking. He had been locked in there for days, maybe longer, with no way out. They said he had been squatting in the house when someone else came and locked him in, likely a former owner or another squatter trying to claim the space. The man was taken to the hospital. He would recover. I gave my statement and left the house behind, shaken but relieved. I could not stop thinking about how close I came to ignoring the sounds, to walking away like it was not my problem. I had always treated the job like it was about cleaning, not caring. Not a day changed that for me. After that incident, I took extra time in every house. I checked every door, every cabinet, every crawl space. I paid attention to the things that felt out of place. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was just junk. But once in a while, I found something that reminded me why I needed to keep looking. I kept doing the job, but I was different. I no longer walked through those houses as if they were just piles of dust and memories. I treated them like stories that were not finished yet. People leave more behind than belongings. Sometimes they leave echoes, and sometimes they leave cries that need someone to hear them. I listened more closely after that. The company recognized my work and eventually offered me more responsibilities. I started training new hires, showing them how to stay alert, how to respect the places they entered. Most of them rolled their eyes when I told them to trust their instincts. But I always reminded them that one moment of attention could save someone's life. Years later, I still remember that house, the door, and the voice that pulled me back. It never left me, and I never wanted it to. That day reminded me that my job, as simple as it seemed, mattered more than I ever realized. And every house I entered after that, I treated like someone might still be there, waiting for someone to care enough to open the door. Story 17. The job ad looked legitimate. It was listed on a popular website I had used before, complete with a company logo, detailed job description, and requirements that matched my experience. I was drawn to it because it promised flexible hours and a decent salary. The contact person responded quickly to my application and scheduled an interview within 2 days. Everything seemed normal until I actually got there. The office was located in a quiet commercial building on the outskirts of the city. It looked a bit run down, but not unusual enough to raise alarm. I arrived early and pressed the buzzer outside. A man in a suit opened the door, gave me a quick nod, and told me to head to the 3rd floor. The elevator was old and creaked all the way up, making me uneasy. The 3rd floor was nearly empty. There were no other people around, no noise, just one door at the end of the hallway with a frosted glass panel. I knocked and was told to come in. The room had a desk, a few chairs, and a filing cabinet, but no personal items or signs of real work being done. A woman sat behind the desk, greeted me, and handed me a clipboard with some forms to fill out. As I filled out the papers, I noticed the questions were unusual. They asked for personal details beyond what a normal job application would require, including emergency contacts, previous home addresses, and banking information. When I hesitated, the woman assured me it was standard for background checks and that the company was strict with its hiring process. I nodded slowly, skipping the more sensitive fields and returning the clipboard. She told me to wait in a smaller room next door for the next phase of the interview. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me. It was a plain room with 2 chairs and a table, no windows, and a security camera in the corner. I sat down, expecting someone to come in, but no one did. 3 minutes passed, then an hour. I knocked on the door, called out, but there was no response. My phone had no signal. I tried the door, but it was locked from the outside. Panic began to rise slowly. I banged on the door, hoping someone would hear, but the only sound was my fists against the wood. I could not understand what was happening. It was just a job interview. How could it turn into this? I tried to stay calm, breathing slowly, thinking through my options. The camera in the corner blinked with a small red light, and I knew someone had to be watching. I spoke directly to it, demanding answers, saying I had family who would look for me if I did not return. My voice echoed in the small space, but no one answered. Time passed painfully slow. Eventually, someone opened the door without saying a word. A man stepped in and asked me to follow him. I demanded to know what was going on, but he only repeated the instruction. I had no choice. I followed him down a dimly lit hallway into another room with several chairs lined against the wall. There were other people there, just sitting in silence, staring at the floor. I tried to ask them questions, but they gave no answers. Their expressions were blank, like they had given up. I did not want to become like them. I kept looking around for anything that could help me understand where I was or how to get out. There were no signs, no windows, and the ceiling had wires running across it, exposed and humming softly. The man returned with a tray of sandwiches and bottled water. He placed it on a small table and left again. No one moved toward it. I grabbed a bottle, but I did not touch the food. I did not trust it. I was not sure if they were trying to keep us fed or drug us. I could not take any chances. When the lights flickered, I saw an opportunity. The power cut out briefly, just long enough to send the room into darkness. I moved quickly to the door and tried the handle. To my surprise, it opened. The lock must have disengaged during the outage. I slipped into the hallway and closed it quietly behind me. I moved fast but carefully, retracing the steps I took when I first arrived. The building was silent except for the faint hum of machinery. I avoided the elevator and headed for the stairwell. My heart pounded with every step, expecting someone to come running after me. But no one did. I reached the first floor and rushed to the exit. The front door was locked, but there was a small maintenance room nearby. I checked inside and found a window just big enough to squeeze through. It took all my strength to pry it open. I climbed out, scraping my arm on the metal frame, but I barely noticed the pain. I hit the ground outside and ran, not stopping until I reached the nearest gas station. The clerk looked alarmed when I stumbled in, breathless and shaking. I asked to use the phone and called 911. When the police arrived, I told them everything. I gave them the address, described the building, and the people inside. They listened closely and took notes.